Hello, I'm Cornell Clayton. I'm the director of the Thomas S. Foley Institute at Washington State University. And on behalf of the Institute, I want to welcome you out to our event today, which features Jennifer Sherman, who will be talking about inequality and rural gentrification. This is part of the Foley Institute's semester-long series on the politics of inequality, which examines the causes, consequences, and perceptions of rising inequality in the US and around the world. Many of you know that the economic disparities in the US and elsewhere have reached record levels that we have not seen in more than a century. Last year, indeed, the 50 wealthiest Americans had more wealth than the bottom 50%, or 165 million Americans combined. Moreover, the pandemic, the crisis on the southern border, the Time's Up movement, the Black Lives Matter protests, and other recent events all highlight nagging problems with racial, gender, social class, geographic, and other forms of inequality. There's no doubt that the growing severity, both in the reality and perception of inequality, are giving rise to populist politics and social polarization in the US and elsewhere. Our series on the politics of inequality began with a distinguished lecture delivered by the Nobel Prize economist Angus Deaton from Princeton, and includes nearly a dozen other lectures by distinguished scholars and commentators on various aspects of inequality, including today's discussion on the problems associated with rural gentrification. If you would like more information about this series or any of our events, please visit us at foley.wsu.edu. And if you miss these events, you can always catch them later on the Foley Institute's YouTube channel. Let me also thank the College of Arts and Sciences at WSU for their continued support of the Foley Institute and their support of this series. Now, it's my pleasure to introduce to you today's guest, Jennifer Sherman, who is a professor of sociology here at Washington State University. Jennifer's research focuses on poverty and inequality, mainly in the rural Northwest. She is the author of numerous journal articles and 2 books, the most recent of which is titled Dividing Paradise, Rural Inequality and the Diminishing American Dream, published this year by the University of California Press. She's also the co-editor of a 2017 volume, Rural Poverty in the United States, which was published by Columbia University Press. Let me also just say, it's a particular pleasure for me to welcome Jennifer today because she's one of our 5 Foley Institute fellows in our partnership with Humanities Washington. So this is a version of the talk which she is giving around the state of Washington as part of the Humanities Washington Speakers Bureau. Jennifer's indicated she's going to take about 30 or 40 minutes to present her ideas to us. And after that, we'll have some time for some discussion. If you have questions, I encourage you to send those to me at tsfoley@wsu.edu. Again, that's TS as in Tom, S. Foley @wsu.edu. So Jennifer, I'm going to turn the time over to you now, and I'll be back later with some questions from our audience.
Thanks so much. I'm just going to take a minute here to share my screen. Okay. Well, thank you so much for joining me today. I'm so happy to have the chance to share my work with you all. And I definitely encourage you to send your comments and questions over, and I will be addressing them at the end. Before I begin today, I would like to acknowledge that Washington State University's locations statewide are on the homelands of Native peoples who've lived in this region from time immemorial. I am broadcasting today from land that is the Aboriginal territory of the Nez Perce and Palouse peoples. I acknowledge that Indigenous lands were often taken by coercive and violent acts and the disregard of treaties. For that, we at WSU extend our deepest apologies and owe our deepest gratitude to the Native peoples of this region. So again, welcome to my talk, which today is based on my new book, Dividing Paradise, Rural Inequality and the Diminishing American Dream. I encourage you to check the book out if you would like to learn more about the issues I discussed today. Of course, there's a lot more in there than I can get through in a 40-minute talk, but I'll do my best. So a bit about me. I am a sociologist here at WSU, and as Cornell said, my work mostly focuses on rural communities in the West, including those with historical ties to land-based industries, including logging. So for this project, I was really interested in a transition from logging to amenity tourism, right? Bringing people into a community to enjoy its natural amenities, really just the commodification of the landscape itself versus extracting something from the land and then selling that product. So I'm going to tell a story today that is very much about the changing fortunes of the rural West. So as we know, the rural West was originally, quote unquote, tamed through the efforts of manifest destiny. And this was the ideology that thought it was our burden, I guess, to bring, again, in quotes, civilization to what was perceived as an endless frontier, but of course was already fully inhabited. Development in the West included things like small scale agriculture and mining, later logging and oil drilling, and eventually industrial agriculture. And all of these industries really grew into the mid 20th century. But subsequently into the later 20th century, we see the opposite trend occur. So deindustrialization, that was the loss of these types of jobs. These natural resource-based economies collapsed and declined in the rural West as they did throughout the nation. In the wake of these types of decline, lots of rural communities have looked for new forms of economic development. Amenity-driven development was really sold to rural communities as something that could very successfully replace those extractive industries, particularly for places that are seen as desirable for outdoor recreation activities, or maybe as a desirable place to retire, a good place to own a second home and things like that. This kind of amenity-based development has many, many positive impacts on these communities in terms of economic growth. But I will argue there are also some undesired side effects, including particularly gentrification and the growth of inequality in these communities. So gentrification, this is what we're here to talk about today. This is a concept that has previously mostly been applied to urban areas. And it's defined as the process whereby the character of a poor area is changed by wealthier people moving in, improving housing and attracting new businesses, typically displacing current inhabitants in the process. Gentrification often comes with a number of negative impacts, usually unintended, and these will include rising housing prices, but also the changing nature of a community and its businesses as new residents just kind of want or demand different types of services. And over time, we start to see the systematic exclusion of both low-income individuals and often people of color from what had previously been their own neighborhoods. And although recently, this was pretty uncommon in rural places, but more recently, and really especially since the coronavirus pandemic, we are seeing gentrification occur in rural communities as well, where it can similarly displace people and rapidly raise housing prices. So for example, lately, you may have heard of this phenomenon of Zoom towns. This is an example, right, where people escape cities during the pandemic in order to live in a less populated area. And this is an example of this process, as the pandemic made it a lot easier for urban dwellers to work remotely and relocate to scenic rural communities in the Northwest and really across the nation. You can also think of examples, places like Bend, Oregon, or Aspen, Colorado, or Sun Valley, Idaho, all of which were once pretty small and working class communities, but now, of course, are quite expensive and elite. So in rural communities, the shift from extractive industries to this heavy reliance on amenity tourism, as well as second home ownership and this amenity in-migration, can create social, cultural, and economic divides between your well-resourced immigrants and the less advantaged locals that they are often displacing. Gentrification occurs as urbanites with higher incomes and higher amounts of wealth purchase land in a rural area, and this will both drive up those prices and, of course, increase housing scarcity. My talk today focuses on a rural Washington community facing exactly this type of dilemma, and I'll look in depth at some of the outcomes. So I'm going to introduce you to the community that I'm calling Paradise Valley. And all of the names of people and places and institutions in this talk are pseudonyms to protect confidentiality. But Paradise Valley, although it's not its real name, is a real place. It's a community of about 5,000 mostly white residents, so not a lot of diversity. Economically, it has become quite dependent on tourism, also a lot of amenity migrants, and a lot of second home ownership. So at this point, more than half of the local homes are owned by non-year-round residents in the community. And nearly half of all the local employment there is in retail or accommodations and food services. Again, these are sectors that are highly tied to that amenity tourism economy. The rise of the tourism industry began as early as the 1970s in Paradise Valley, as Washington State's logging industry really began to collapse. So in Paradise Valley, declines in resource-based industries, including logging, but also things like mining, farming, and ranching, they were all sort of countered in the late 20th and early 21st centuries by rises in the recreation and tourism industries, which now do really dwarf those land-based industries in their shares of the local labor market. Basically, as Paradise Valley became known as a recreation destination, it attracted more and more second home owners and retirement migrants. And then as technology improved and allowed for more remote work and easier communication with family and friends elsewhere, we also see the community really begin to see a rapid rise in younger migrants, often working age folks who are just telecommuting or just relocating, bringing families with them, bringing children, often with the belief that it was just kind of a better, more wholesome environment in which to raise their children. So in my work to learn about places like Paradise Valley, I use what are called qualitative methods. And for those of you who are unfamiliar with this, it basically means studying social patterns by interacting directly with people in the social world, with individuals, and then just analyzing the patterns that I find. So for me, this research consists of in-depth interviews with people that are recorded and then transcribed and analyzed, and also what's called participant observation, which basically means just taking part in different aspects of everyday life, writing a lot of notes about what I observe while I'm doing it, and then analyzing those as well. A lot of what I'll be presenting today will be quotes from those open-ended in-depth interviews that I did, but I'll also be drawing somewhat from my observations and interactions within the community. So what I actually did to do this type of research was I moved to Paradise Valley for 10 months of what's called fieldwork from 2014 to 2015. Over that time, I did conduct 84 of these in-depth recorded interviews. And I also spent those 10 months doing a lot of this participant observation. And this included regular volunteer jobs at a local food bank and a family support center and a public library. I also volunteered regularly for all sorts of local events and organizations around the community. But I also just tried to really immerse myself into everyday life there as much as I could. So I tried to get to know people across the social class spectrum in this place, tried to get involved in as many things as I could, and really just get a feel for what life was like in this community. And through this research, I came to discover that Paradise Valley was really made up of two pretty distinct groups of people who didn't interact a lot with each other, and they lived very different lives within this same really quite small place. Throughout this talk, I'm going to refer to them as newcomers and oldtimers. And these are labels that I chose in part because these were terms that people really used on the ground, and in part because they were sort of more polite than some of the other terms that they used often on the ground. But I want to just point out that they're a little misleading because really, as you can see here, these are not terms that refer just to how long a person has lived in the community, but they're really much more about social class. And I would argue that the nature of this divide is as much about social class as it is about when you move to this place. But these two groups are generally different in a number of ways, including the following ones that were really important to my research. So your newcomers tended to be the more recent immigrants. Most of them had lived in the valley for less than 20 years. And I heard that figure over and over and over again. People would tell me you're not a local until you've been here at least 20 years. But they were also people who tended to have higher education. So they were more likely to have a college degree or higher. They tended to have higher incomes, and they tended to have more wealth. So when a sociologist talks about wealth, I don't necessarily mean that every single one of them was extremely wealthy, although some of them definitely were. But wealth just really refers to what you own versus what you make. So wealth can be houses and land, it can be cars, it can be bank accounts, it can be stocks and bonds, but they owned more stuff than the other group. They also tended to be politically pretty liberal for the most part. And culturally, they had interest in things like your outdoor endurance sports, hiking, biking, trail running, that kind of stuff. the arts, both visual and theater, and things like literature. So I heard a lot about book clubs from my newcomers. And they really did contrast pretty strongly with the old timers. These were folks who mostly had been there longer, usually more than 20 years. Many of them had grown up in the region or spent most of their lives there. They did tend to have lower educational attainment, more likely to just have a high school degree. They mostly had lower incomes, and they definitely tended to have a lot less wealth. Generally, they tended to be more politically conservative, although they weren't all voters, and they weren't as, it wasn't as clear of a trend as it was with the newcomers. And in terms of sort of cultural interests, we see a much more working class background here. So they talk to me about things like hunting and fishing and horse packing, your more sort of traditionally rural interests and pursuits. And as I got to know people across Paradise Valley, I uncovered a number of different ways in which these differences that I just outlined made life a lot easier for the newcomers than it was for the old timers. So in the book, I document the systematic ways in which the community's resources really came to be held by those newcomers while excluding the old timers. And in the book, I talk about a number, including work and the labor market, housing and home ownership, childcare and work-family balance, just can you afford childcare and somebody to watch your kids while you work, social integration into the community, giving and receiving informal aid. So do you have social networks who will help you out when you need it? And then access to education and just kind of children's experiences in school. In today's talk, I'm mostly going to focus on just these first two areas. So work and the labor market and housing, but you'll see social integration plays a pretty important role as well. But in all of these arenas and many more that I don't really talk about in the book, newcomers have access to multiple types of resources, so financial, but also non-financial, non-economic, or what we call symbolic resources in sociology, but different types of resources that make it a lot easier for them to navigate the challenges of rural living. I'm also going to discuss today the ways in which newcomers often failed to see their own privilege and the systematic disadvantage that the old timers faced. And this is a phenomenon that I call class blindness. So I define class blindness as the tendency for those with social class privilege to be blind, to be unaware of their own advantages and to their impacts on less advantaged populations around them. I argue that the failure to acknowledge these types of differences and the unequal access to power and opportunities that they create can really undermine empathy for another person, compassion for their struggles, and ultimately will weaken our abilities to help each other. Okay, so work and the labor market. Well, since that decline in the land-based industries and the transition to a mainly tourism-driven economy, Paradise Valley had seen, as I mentioned, a growth in jobs in just a few sectors. And these included things like entertainment and recreation. Retail was also a significant employer, as was construction, since there's so much demand for new housing there. These jobs have in common that they tend to be lower paid, lacking benefits, seasonal, non-unionized, and or less than full-time. And this is a really sharp contrast with those manufacturing and forest products jobs of the past, which tended to be more stable. They were often year-round. They were mostly unionized, and they were living wage jobs. The result of this change, this new trend, has been that everybody is struggling to find decent work that can support a family in this place, particularly if you lack the safety net of wealth or some sort of family help to fall back on. For newcomers, these trends often meant that when they moved there, they took pay cuts and they took jobs that didn't fully utilize their education or their training or their job experience, right? They tended to be underemployed in this new place. They described having to settle for lower salaries and fewer benefits and longer hours than they might have had to elsewhere. Many of them had to take work that paid pretty low wages compared to what they could get somewhere else. And this was the case for Frank Brooks, who told me, certainly I cut my salary in half by moving here, and I turned down a job that was going to pay me a couple $100,000 more than that. That was hard, but we made that decision to move to Paradise Valley. And we hear something similar from Anya Wilburn here, a nurse who explained You have to be willing to accept less pay, to not have full benefits, to work way harder, versus in the city, I could go and get triple the money, double the money at least, and have set call days. It's a totally different work environment in terms of a provider. It's rough out here. But nonetheless, many of these newcomers traded in on their education, their previous work experience, their personal connections to other folks like them, and their different types of cultural competences to find or create jobs that they found meaningful and rewarding. So Claire Woods told me, everybody who comes here starts a nonprofit. So I started a nonprofit, never tried that before. And that attracted the attention of another nonprofit that was working on forestry and fire prevention. And they wanted me to work for them. So I got a better paying job for them. And that just kept leading to other things. And here we have a sort of different trajectory from Sean Murphy, a carpenter, who said, I've always felt capable enough of doing whatever. Then I've never had to worry about getting a job. It's like, I'm happy to go do some physical labor thing. I can do construction. I have those tools. And there's construction here, no problem. I can do that. I didn't move here with any sort of plan on what I was going to do. So between their ease in finding work and their abilities to rely on reserves of wealth, such as savings and houses that were paid off, newcomers were able to generally live pretty comfortably in Paradise Valley. And they often did like what they did. But this often meant that they couldn't quite understand those folks for whom things weren't so easy. So here we see Sean Murphy again, and he told me, people who say they can't find a job, that doesn't ring true to me. Finding a job that pays you enough to, say, buy land or a house, that's a different thing. So there's jobs available. I think there's a lot of people in the Valley who choose not to work those low-level jobs and instead choose to rely on assistance. I feel like if you have the initiative and then the human connections, the personal relationships that come with being here for a while, there's never a shortage of work to be done or found or created. But it does take initiative and somebody actually who's willing to bust ass and work hard. And so I feel like there are those opportunities. And sometimes there's a dearth of character as it relates to people willing to do those things. So we see here from Sean a real blindness to his own privilege in terms of wealth and housing, but also education and social connections, all of which made it a lot easier for him to find a job, anytime, and to survive on the low wages that the local jobs paid, right? And he acknowledges those kinds of non-economic resources matter, but he just doesn't understand why not everybody has them. And again, sort of blames people's individual lack of character for their struggles. But old-timers almost all struggle to make ends meet in Paradise Valley. They discuss problems with the seasonal work and layoffs and the inability to make ends meet on those low wages that both seasonal work and service work provided. Unlike the newcomers, most of the old-timers were not ultimately satisfied with their outcomes in terms of job security or wages or hours or flexibility or even just the nature of the work itself. Pam Rhodes, who was a service worker, told me, it is way hand to mouth. It is not so good here. I'm reluctant to make any changes, even though I feel like I don't earn much more than a basic living wage, and I'm 57. So you know what that's going to look like when you try to retire. I mean, I'll have Social Security, end of story, right? No savings if I keep at this job. But right now I would never dare to change. So really a sense of being stuck. Mark Tate, who worked in retail, told me there's many people here that I know that have not just one good job, but they have like 3 or 4 jobs just to make ends meet. The jobs are seasonal and some just don't pay well. And Owen Roberts, who worked in maintenance, told me it is really hard to find jobs here in the Valley, especially full-time jobs year-round, right? The kinds of jobs people needed just weren't there. And rather than finding ways to just make it work like the newcomers did, the old-timers tended to discuss making really tough choices and sacrifices to their basic needs. So Wes Thompson told me, yeah, it's tight, but we can survive. Once in a while, we'll have to go without the internet for a month or 2, maybe a couple weeks, but we got rid of a lot of stuff. We don't have satellite TV anymore. We just run local stations. We budget tight. My wife's really good about doing the budgets, figuring out what we need to do. We always have enough food to keep us going. But in order to make sure they had enough food, they relied quite regularly on the food bank. And old-timers often found that they lacked either the types of skills or reputations or connections that would allow them to find those better jobs, right? Exactly those kinds of things that Sean Murphy mentioned as everybody should just have. Often though, for the old timers, their local connections had kind of the opposite effect. So because it was a small community, people tended to remember that mistakes that folks had made in high school or mistakes that their larger families or clans had made. And they would be judged as undesirable employees based on these mistakes. So the second quote I'm going to read here comes from an unemployed man whose family had really deep roots in the valley, but also a pretty tarnished local reputation. And although he was often looking for work, he really struggled to find any job stability in the valley. And he felt that this reputation was a really big part of the problem. So here's Caleb telling me, apparently I've gotten a reputation around the valley. I'm not sure how, as a drug dealer, a troublemaker. I look at him and I'm like, really? I'll take a drug test right now. I don't do drugs. It's like my dad was friends with a couple of drug dealers and apparently they connected dots. I'm like, you can connect all the dots you want. It's not going to add up. But these multiple forms of disadvantage meant that old timers were just much more likely to struggle to find jobs, and they were much more likely to struggle to make ends meet on the seasonal and low wage jobs that they were able to find. Shifting now to the housing market, we see basically the same pattern, right? Newcomers again tend to be at a major advantage here. Most of them were moving to Paradise Valley from urban areas where their homes were worth significantly more than property in the valley. And that, of course, allowed them to purchase these large and impressive homes, often with custom detailing, expansive views, and large acreage. For them, housing was rarely a major concern, and they frequently talked about just how affordable it was. So Roger Clark, a retiree, explained, we inherited some money from my folks, and that helped buy this property. Along with my aunt, I got money from my aunt. And so that helped us, I think, all in all, with her and my mom and dad's inheritance. And we bought this piece of land. Plus, we sold our home. We sold the 10 acres near Seattle. So all of that accumulated and helped us buy this place and have money to build this home. So things worked out well for us in that respect. And they had a beautiful, enormous home on a lot of land. And here's Sean Murphy, again, our carpenter, saying, I came here with a nest egg. But that was also the culmination of a lot of years of working toward that goal of building my own house, buying property. And so it's like I worked and I bought and sold a few things, all with the goal of getting to a place where I didn't have to. It's not like I'm retired. I'm nowhere near retired, but I wanted to get to a place where I didn't have to kill myself with a huge mortgage and force myself in that situation to work all the time. So again, here we see sort of the secret to his easy life, right? This nest egg, this wealth, this house that's paid off, all makes it a lot easier for him to choose whatever work he wants and not have to be stressed financially. And these types of stories were really contrasted with those of the old timers, for whom housing really was one of the most serious struggles they faced. Newcomers' failure to understand just how difficult housing was for the old timers was yet another way in which this class blindness really manifested. So the old timers described a number of things. They talked about those rising home values, making it just prohibitively expensive for them to buy land, to buy homes if they didn't already have significant wealth to invest. Also, for those who already own their homes, the rising home values meant increased tax burdens, and this was a real struggle for people with limited cash flow, including people who had retired. On the other end of the spectrum, for those who couldn't get into the ownership market, rising rents were becoming increasingly unaffordable for those with those low wage jobs. So those in the service sector and the tourism industry just couldn't afford the rents anymore. On top of that, landlords often had explicit preferences for newcomers or for people without children or pets. So again, really discriminating against those local families who desperately needed housing. The result for the old timers was significant housing stress, housing insecurity, and for a number of people, even homelessness. So I heard a lot about this, including from Emmett Farley, who'd grown up in the Valley and said, that's one of the things that I find, really sad about here is it is so hard for young families to find affordable housing. It really sucks to grow up in an area, and by the time you are old enough and raising your own family, you can't do the same work that your parents did and still get by. Adeline Thompson, she's the wife of Wes, whom we met a little bit earlier, said, I'm always worried about the future. I didn't plan on spending almost 18 years in a single wide trailer. I wanted a house before I was 40. It never happened. And Ryan Boyle, who grew up there, told me, I feel like I wasn't allowed to inherit my kingdom. You know, like I grew up here, I paid my dues. I thought everybody at least should get their acre, their house, you know, just your chunk to make it. So as I've discussed, access to resources meant that newcomers and old-timers had really different experiences in the Valley. And although vast differences existed in the level of real and symbolic resources between these two groups, without really knowing each other well, they frequently didn't understand the nature of each other's struggles. And in particular, I found that the newcomers frequently really judged the old-timers, assuming that their troubles were the outcome of individuals' poor choices or bad behaviors or lack of moral values or work ethics, rather than that they came from systematic differences in their access to these other types of resources. So while the old timers often spoke at length about their own work ethics and how hard they struggled to survive and be independent and never ask anybody for help, the newcomers tended to describe them instead as lazy drug addicts and welfare cheats and all sorts of really negative stereotypes that we often hold of the poor in the US. So Jim Kelly, a business owner, told me rural communities can cut slack to some people that it allows them to be more dysfunctional. And then there is a fringe economy. And I'll just say this, you can drive around and you can see it. Small old travel trailers packed behind houses. And those are rental units. People are renting those out to people. And a lot of those people are doing things in exchange for the rent that are not good. Criminal activities of various sorts, whether it's drugs or whatever, prostitution. So real judgment of people who lived in substandard housing. I interviewed a lot of people who lived permanently in these types of travel trailers, and many, many, many of them were not drug dealers or prostitutes, I have to say. But they just had, multiple negative understandings of the old timers without really knowing them well. Claire Woods said, it seems to me that the ones who are born and raised here and stayed here and never left are pretty ignorant. And recent retiree Peter Williams told me, there are mothers, young obese mothers with their babies that are living on food stamps. Good chance their father isn't there anymore. There's domestic violence, unwed mothers, teen pregnancies. That stuff is going to happen to them and then to their kids. So again, a whole list of kind of moral infractions that he imagined these folks had committed. And although they tried really hard to counter them through both their words and their actions, old timers often were very well aware of these types of judgments, and it left them feeling angry and resentful, but also excluded and alone within their own community. Local artist Irene Nelson told me, you are ending up with this social clash. Unfortunately, I really do see a class war starting to really develop. Before, nobody had a huge amount, but it was still within this broad band. Now you are seeing some folks appear and they are very disdainful to everybody else. Martha Crawford, who lived her whole life in the Valley, told me the community isn't the same as it used to be. Now it's all the people that moved from Seattle or Colorado, California, and it is a beautiful area to come and live in. I'll grant them that. But I wish they would just think a time or two about the people that lived here for so many years, kept things going. I like people, and I usually say good morning or hello or how are you or something. And I've had looks that looked at me like, oh, I don't know you. And this sense of exclusion was noted even by old timers who tried to reach out to the newcomer community, but often described just feeling snubbed and excluded. Megan Wicker, a stay-at-home mom, told me, when I used to go to church with my friend outside of the Valley, I felt very supported, like they wanted to save me and they wanted to help me and they would help me anyway. And then when I went with my recent friend here, I don't know if it was just the church or the people that go to that church, but I felt more like pushed away, like I wasn't somebody they wanted in their church. I just kind of felt awkward there, like I wasn't one of them. And Allison Lloyd told me, so everybody has, in a small town, everybody has their own views of you. I really don't care what people think of me, but I guess it does hinder me from doing stuff though, too, that I don't want to, I guess it's easier to just, I can know what they think about me all day long, but having to go deal with it is another thing. Right. So real sense of just not wanting to be part of the community anymore because of that judgment. So in the end, Paradise Valley was this pretty divided community in which these two groups had very little commonality, and they just really didn't interact a lot or understand each other's experiences. And this meant that this one group was able to sort of systematically amass the bulk of the community's resources amongst themselves, while simultaneously blaming the other group for its lack of resources. And I argue that this failure to see and to respond to social class inequality has multiple negative impacts on a rural community in Paradise Valley. So in the book, I explore this self-perpetuating inequality, right, as the one group dominates the community's best jobs and housing, but they also have more access to reliable childcare. They have more educational access for their children. They have more social support from, friends and neighbors who have more resources to share, and they have more power within the community. And the other group becomes increasingly disempowered and marginalized within their own home. I find that this results in exclusion, as I've shown, but also dehumanization, frustration, and anger from the other side. In the book, I also discuss the increasing divide in understanding and worldviews between the two groups, and I find that they just don't understand or relate to each other, and really they prefer not to interact at all. And this really undermines the social cohesion that has long been associated with rural communities, right? We think of small towns as a place where everybody knows everybody and everybody's going to help everybody. Well, not if you don't interact, right? So in the book, I discuss these decreases in social cohesion and decrease in concern for fellow residents on the other side of the social divide. And I find that even those, more privileged people who truly do want to help the less fortunate often don't want to interact directly with individuals. So frequently they preferred to give their money to a nonprofit or, some third party and have that service agency distribute help rather than just going directly and offering help to their neighbors. I also look in depth at the political and cultural divisions that arise from this and just the sort of failure to see the world in similar ways at all. Right, this social divide not only undermines people's abilities to care about and directly help each other, but it bleeds into these other realms like politics, where the residents of Paradise Valley, just as in other gentrified communities, and really I would argue the US more generally, have become increasingly divided. So I want to end on a somewhat positive note after this dark tale. What can we do? So I would argue that healing social divides, both in a place like Paradise Valley and in our larger nation, requires a combination of micro and macro level efforts to support healthy families and healthy communities and healthy relationships between residents. I would have to argue if you have to address these problems on multiple levels, it can't happen at any one level. But on the large scale, we really need to think about public policies that support all families and adults. And these can be things like healthcare or childcare or housing support or living wages. But we really want to think at both the federal and the state level about policies that can even the playing field and help decrease the inequality that's just built into the structure of our society. Basically, we need to give everybody an equal chance to make it through work, not just those folks who already have a whole bunch of other resources. Secondly, on the community scale, I spent a lot of time, as I mentioned, working in social services around the Valley, and I saw some really positive things there. And I want to pause just for a second to think about the ways in which communities help those people in need. One of the things I noticed was that charitable and aid efforts, right, service efforts that try to build connections between the more and less advantaged residents really helped to build trust and understanding and empathy. So in particular, what I found is that if you focus on not just, handing a bag of food to somebody, but really getting to know them while you're doing it, learning about them, learning about their struggles and their needs and their preferences, that creates that empathy and it creates trust. And you've also created a connection between two people who now, when they see each other somewhere else, might actually, stop and chat and build upon that connection. And that sort of brings me to the individual scale, right? in our daily lives, I think there's room for each of us to find ways to reach out to those who are the least like us and to try to humanize those encounters in order to share our resources and start to cross those divides that are growing between us. So I would encourage everybody listening today to get to know the neighbors who are least like you. I argue this can significantly improve and enrich all of our lives and all of our communities, right? So just think about checking your assumptions about other groups of people or other individuals, right, before you judge another person, and try reaching out to those people you encounter through your social institutions. It can be your schools or churches, it can be kids' sports, whatever it is. But really, in these different settings, think about resisting that instinct to only get to know or only associate with, only make connections to those folks who seem the most similar to you, and really try to get to know those who seem the most different. And I think that's, a relatively small step, but something that can, in the end, really help us all. And I'm going to end there and open it up for questions. Thank you so much for listening, for taking the time today. And I'm going to unshare this screen.
Great, thanks, Jen. Really interesting. I got lots of questions from the audience, but I want to begin with asking you whether or not you think this is really a story about rural versus urban areas, because it seems to me a lot of the problems you discuss, from the problems created by deindustrialization and decline in union jobs, to rising housing costs, to the collapse of social capital in the communities, you see the exact same problems in urban communities as you described. So I wonder if it's really a rural story or just a story about what's taking place more broadly as our economy's restructured itself over the past 2 decades or so.
Yeah, that's a really great question. And honestly, I argue in the book that this is a microcosm of what is going on in the United States. I think we're seeing some version of this story sort of in all of our communities, but also across the nation as a whole. We are an increasingly unequal and divided nation. And this is just sort of one little version of it. I started out expecting this to be a rural story, but I'm with you. I don't think it is uniquely or distinctly rural at this point. It is really distinctly American, perhaps.
Okay, I have a question from Jake Gibbs, and he says, first of all, I find your work compelling and accurate as a rural Oregon timber community resident, so thank you very much. But he asks, could you expand on the terms liberal and conservative as political labels? More specifically, I'm curious on newcomers and old-timers' views on the role and responsibility of government, and if this perspective on government is reflected in political labels.
Yeah, that's a good question, Jake. I was really just asking people about, which parties they adhered to or preferred, who they voted for, and things like that. So mostly that's coming out of the ways that they answered those questions. But as you suggested, who we vote for doesn't map exactly onto our other understanding. So a lot of the folks, particularly the newcomers who said that they were Democrats, also, expressed a lot of interest in helping address poverty or inequality, but many of them stopped short of really supporting government interventions. Welfare and programs like that are not real popular with anyone at this point. On the other hand, the folks that the old-timers tended to be very much kind of anti-big government. That was just the discourse really at the time. I was doing this research at the end of the Obama presidency, and that was really a very popular discourse at that time period, the sort of anti-government, anti-big government. And that meant many different things to many people, particularly because a lot of times they had very personal experiences with what they saw as like the government. And that could take all sorts of forms. It wasn't entirely, state or federal. They often didn't know what it was, but they knew the government had harmed them in some way. So it was kind of an umbrella category that fit a lot of wrongs that they felt had been done to them. So I don't know if that's the answer you were looking for, but yeah, to some degree it's politics and some degree other things.
So a related question from Gus Waters, and I think this is more about party politics rather than perceptions of government. But he says, has this rural gentrification affected politics in Washington? And I assume what he means here is, do you see some districts that used to be ruby red in voting patterns starting to turn purple or blue? or have you studied that at all?
I mean, certainly that was going on the ground here, you know, where the more of these newcomers that are moving in and voting Democrat, the more this very red county was starting to look a little bit more purple. At the point that I was doing this research, it was still mostly a red county, but at the local level, you know, when you got to the sort of the township level, we were seeing much more blue. So it was dividing the county to a large degree because Paradise Valley is only part of that region.
Mm-hmm. Nancy Cheney asks a question, and it's a couple of other folks have asked a similar question. She says, thanks for this research and your presentation. You describe new employment opportunities in Paradise Valley in sectors like entertainment, food, retail, while other previously solid sectors declined. I would imagine that COVID put the kibosh on some of these personal contact jobs since your immersive research took place in 2014, 2016. Have you followed up with residents there to ascertain economic impacts of gentrification on these new jobs subsequent to COVID?
I mean, there's been a few changes over the pandemic. Obviously, at first, there was a massive loss of jobs as Washington State kind of shut down a lot of these types of services. And there was just a real dip, of course, in the tourism industry in 2020. And then by 2021, as things are opening up, they're seeing the same problem that everywhere else is seeing, where things aren't staying open, they can't find enough employees. And I think to a large degree, at least part of what that has to do with is during the same time period, rents were just going through the roof, right? Housing in the valley was really, really hot during the pandemic. And I suspect that a lot of the folks who were working those types of jobs have had to leave because even in 2020, what I was hearing on the ground was that the local rents had risen to levels that basically equaled the local salary in a service job, meaning that you would have nothing left over at all for any other types of expenses. So housing had become just prohibitively expensive for people working in those sectors. And, you know, the businesses are suffering, but that's not unique. That's happening kind of everywhere right now.
Mm-hmm. So Jamie Johnson asks about a specific policy, wants to know how effective or fair you think grandfathered property tax rates would be at addressing the rising cost of living for old-timers as a result of gentrification. Yeah. I
mean, it would certainly be helpful for those folks who are struggling with cash flow issues. It sort of just depends. There certainly are people who've lived there a long time who've done okay in this economy, often the very large landowners and things like that. So does everybody need it to the same degree? No, but I think maybe some sort of relief that you could apply for would make a big difference, because that was a story I heard a lot, was getting taxed out of property and people talking about, we don't know what we're going to do when we retire because we can't afford the taxes here anymore.
Mm-hmm. So Carissa Milgrove asks, and wants you to know she's watching from off the grid in a cabin in rural Okanagan County. She says, since a lot of people relocate to cheaper rural areas because of gentrification happening in the urban areas, what do you think some of the ultimate root causes of gentrification, the gentrification domino effect are?
I would have to say there's the absolute crisis in affordable housing in the US right now. Housing has just increasingly become out of reach for middle-class folks as well as people who are lower income. And it's just getting worse. So yeah, you're right. It is a domino effect. And it's again, not really limited to this community. It's just sort of a microcosm of what we're seeing across the US, where except in places that are really losing population, any place that's growing, we're not building affordable housing to keep up with it. We're really, still thinking of housing as very much a for-profit business, and that model is just not working right now.
So John Romero asks, and I'm not sure, I don't know this term, maybe you do. Do you think we're headed towards a social credit system?
I don't think I know that term either.
Okay, well, John, maybe you can write back and clarify what that term is. Jeremy Street asks, what is amenity migrant? What is the definition of an amenity migrant? And secondly, did these people know you were doing research? Did you use a tape recorder?
Okay, so basically an amenity migrant would be somebody who migrates into a place because of the natural amenities of that place. So, you might think of somebody who's moving in because they want to live next to a lake or live in the mountains or be close to a ski hill or that sort of thing. So those are all examples of amenity migration, just, moving around in order to get closer to those natural amenities. And yes, I was very open with what I was doing. The interviews were all not just recorded, but people had to read and sign and talk about with me consent forms that explained what I was doing, what my aims were, what I was using it for, and that promised confidentiality and that I wouldn't use their names. And similarly, in the participant observation, it's of course a little bit harder to constantly reintroduce yourself to every single person you interact with, but anyone who did bother to talk to me and get to know me learned that this is what I was doing. So I was open throughout, and people knew it. That I was watching.
So I have an anonymous viewer who asks, you talked a lot about the ill effects of gentrification. What do you see as the benefits of gentrification?
Yeah, that's a really good question too. And I mean, there really are so many benefits, and that was really what got me first interested, honestly, in this community and this topic, was that in the past I had researched in depth in a similar project, another former logging community that had lost all the logging jobs, but didn't have any kind of amenity tourism or gentrification going on. And that community was really, really, really struggling and didn't have lots of services, didn't have much new building going on. There weren't people moving in, et cetera. And I was fascinated by Paradise Valley when I first saw it, because I was like, wow, this place is so vibrant. There's so much going on here. There's so many services. It's a really beautiful place. And that is mainly due to this particular form of economic development. So it really can revitalize communities. And I've been asked before by people who live in places like this, like, should we have not come? Should we have not moved here? Should we have not visited this place? And I don't think that's the answer at all. I don't think I'm trying to argue that nobody should move to a pretty place, but rather that we should be more mindful when we pursue economic development options to make sure that they include everybody, that they're inclusive, and that, that it's not just the people with the most resources who are benefiting from whatever changes occur.
So let me ask you another question. This has to do with where I happen to have a home up in Coeur d'Alene. And it's a little bit different than what you describe in your book. I mean, here there has been a gentrification taking place for sure. A lot of the newcomers here, however, are much more conservative than the old-timers. Mm-hmm. So it's a different kind of political change that's taking place, and it's created all sorts of problems in Coeur d'Alene and also other places in Eastern Washington. So I wonder if you've looked at that kind of transformation in politics in rural communities.
I haven't as much. No, that's, yeah, I mean, gentrification doesn't have to be at all displacing people with more liberal folks. It's usually just some sort of displacement, some group of people that is different from the original inhabitants, or the earlier, I shouldn't say original, inhabitants of this place. But no, I haven't spent much time in communities that are seeing that particular pattern, unless you count like Moscow, Idaho, where I live, which is similar.
So another viewer asks whether or not you could elaborate on how the collapse in social capital has affected rural communities. And I think you talked a little bit about this already, but maybe you could expand on that.
Yeah, I mean, in the case of this particular community, it's not so much a collapse in social capital. I think of it more as kind of almost hoarding of social capital. So there's plenty of social capital there. It's just not being shared equally with everybody. The newcomers had really, really high amounts of social capital, and people told me over and over again, oh, it was so easy to make friends here. It was a really easy place to become integrated, and I have such a supportive community, and everybody helps everybody here. It's so great. There was plenty of social capital, but it just wasn't being shared amongst the low-income folks. So I think in rural communities and sort of, again, like across the nation, what we're really seeing is that the stigmatizing of poverty, the stigmatizing of these kinds of struggles also has the impact of removing social capital. So nobody wants to share with people that they see as, morally inferior in some way, as not worthy. And this misunderstanding of what is causing economic struggle, I think, is resulting in a loss of social capital for people who are struggling. And I see that across the board.
Yeah. So Mandy Clayson, she says, she grew up in a similar rural community with a history of logging that's now turned to tourism. And she says, she saw a generational divide. The old timers, the older generation of the old timers were resentful of the newcomers, but younger people were not. And she's wondering if you saw that kind of generational divide.
Not quite as you're describing it there, Mandy, but what I saw was, so as I mentioned, there's the newcomer and old timer label. They're not entirely about time in the community. So because I was categorizing people based on multiple aspects of social class status besides just how long they lived in the community, there actually were people that were categorized as quote unquote newcomers who were born in the community, basically to newcomer parents. And so again, what I found was that social class was reproducing itself. So folks that were basically born to old timers tended to have an old timer experience versus people who were born in the community, but whose parents were wealthier immigrants and had higher education and had all these, social capital and cultural capital. They tended to very much align with the newcomers, and they had experiences that looked much more similar. They were much more likely to out-migrate, to go to college. A lot of them didn't come back, but those who did also, they came back again with more of these resources, and they just sort of assumed their place amongst the newcomer community, even though they were actually from the community.
Yeah, so I think we have time for one last question. Jake Gibbs asks about whether or not you think there are lessons for leaders of the traditional industries, the land-based extractive industries in these communities, and how they might capitalize on the strengths of both groups, both the old timers and newcomers, and keep themselves more viable.
That's a good question. Yeah, I mean, I think there are so many strengths to having people coming into your community who bring new ideas and bring education and skills and resources. And there's, I think it's not that hard for local employers to envision how they can build off of those resources. The struggle that I saw sort of across the board in Paradise Valley was that they failed to recognize the value of the folks who didn't leave, who weren't coming from somewhere else, who had grown up in this place. And I think figuring out ways to integrate those locals into the labor market would really, really benefit not just the community, but those local businesses themselves, because you've got people who are much more tied to the community, who often have local knowledge and institutional knowledge of that local community that can be really, really helpful and help you to make smarter choices as a business. And often they just need a little bit of training. And so things like, reaching out to people while they're still in high school and getting them involved, internships, et cetera, finding ways to start to train folks a little bit younger from within the community can allow businesses to really build off of those local strengths while still, maybe taking advantage of whatever new strengths are coming in from outside of the community.
Okay, well, I'm afraid our time's up. Before I thank our guest, let me remind you that our next event in this series is next Wednesday, October 20th at noon. And we're going to have Amber Wachowski from Marquette University discussing how our perceptions of class affect our efforts to address inequality in America. And now let me thank Jennifer Sherman for a terrific discussion, and thank all of you for tuning in. Thanks again, Jen.
Thank you.